Audio Network. I am your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I am not joined by Scott Karasik, my usual co-host. Filling in for Scott is none other than RiseUpReader's own Matt Karoly. Matt is coming back to the show to help guest star as the second wheel to this unicycle that I am carrying on this podcast. But welcome back to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Aaron. It's always a pleasure to be on with you talking Falcons football.
All right. So, guys, on this episode, we are going to talk about the first week of free agency with the Falcons focus, talking about the signing of Brandon Fusco. Today, we got another signing of Logan Paulson. We'll talk a little bit about some of these guys that the Falcons have worked out and shown interest in, reported interest in over the last couple of days. And, of course, we will be answering your mailbag question, as usual. So let's kick things off, Matt, and talk about the signing of Brandon Fusco. The Falcons signed him last week on the first day officially of free agency, last Wednesday, to a 3-year contract. Today they signed Logan Paulson, the tight end, also of the 49ers, to a 1-year deal. We don't know the terms yet, but we can. I'm going to guess a veteran minimum deal. Let's start with Fusco first. What exactly is Brandon Fusco bringing to the table?
I think first and foremost is probably just a veteran presence. You know, someone that's had over 80-plus starts in his career, spanning the Minnesota Vikings and most recently the San Francisco 49ers. Who he was now with a year under Kyle Shanahan's system. So I think the biggest thing that I'm excited about his signing is the fact that it's a guy who, one, is a veteran, but two, has now experience in the Shanahan offense, which Atlanta runs. So it's going to be a seamless transition. I mean, the contract, pretty much the terms speak to him more likely than not being the day one starter on opening day this coming year at right guard. At first when it happened, I was a little bit shocked because I thought, they weren't totally disappointed in Wes Schweitzer's play, and I know the fan base obviously disagrees with that, but I thought from a 6th-round pick, second-year player, first time ever in the NFL, I thought he wasn't bad, and I thought they could roll with that, but obviously the front office thought otherwise, and kudos to them for not resting on their laurels and finding a veteran, finding someone with experience that, again, has experience in this offense, no less, and is a fit in this offense. And, he's still going to be the 5th best offensive lineman on this Falcons team, starting offensive lineman on this team. But he's definitely an upgrade over Schweitzer and I would say Garland as well. So you're getting a veteran there. You're getting someone who knows what he's doing, who's not going to get overwhelmed by some of the more premier interior defensive lineman in this league. So, it's a great signing. The money works. So, I definitely approve of Brandon Fusco to the Falcons.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I don't have a whole lot else to add on top of that. I do think Schweitzer is a little bit underrated by the fan base, but certainly I can't fault the Falcons given how well or how poorly the interior offensive line performed down the stretch once Levitri was out of the lineup, that they wanted to have a little bit more of a veteran presence like Fusco is. I think you can make the case that if Schweitzer did develop a little bit further this upcoming season, probably where you would expect him to be is at a level probably where Fusco's floor potential would be. We'll see sort of if Fusco makes significant growth this year now that he'll be in a second year playing in a very similar offense in the Shanahan offense that he played in San Francisco. The benefit of playing between Mack and Schrader certainly should benefit him to a certain extent. But given all these D tackles landing in the NFC, it's not going to be an easy job for whoever lines up at right guard for the Falcons, just because you have Sheldon Richardson in Minnesota. Of course, Aaron Donald's still in L.A. Maybe Sue is going to land in L.A. Who knows? New Orleans. So it's one of those things where, regardless of who's lining up at that guard spot, is going to be tested quite a bit this year. So we'll see if Fusco answers the challenge. I think he'll be a solid addition to the Falcons. I don't necessarily think he's going to run away with it and make people start forgetting about, John Asamoah or Harvey Dahl or Robbie Tobeck or any of the great guards in Falcons history. but certainly he should be a solid piece for the next year or two.
I think one of the things you kind of mentioned in your piece on Fusco's, breaking down the game film, how he kind of, held his own. I mean, no one gets the better of Aaron Donald in the NFL, but the fact that he held his own against a guy like that in his 2 matchups last year, I really believe probably when the front office saw the disaster that happened in that first playoff game against the Rams in that first half, I think that was part of the motivation that led them to believe that, maybe we can't roll with Wes Schweitzer long term at right guard just because they're going to have to go up against the likes of Aaron Donalds and Fletcher Cox if they want to get back to the Super Bowl. So I think that in combination with Fusco, handling his business somewhat, winning occasionally against a guy like Donald, which is all you can really ask for a right guard in that situation, I think that had a lot to do with this signing.
Yeah, I think the Falcons sort of basically, they probably, not to discredit their pro scouting department, but they probably just looked down the list of players that graded well against Donald last season and were like, please let one of these guys be a free agent. And Fusco was probably the one guy that had a decent grade going up against Donald. And they were like, might as well sign him. It's better than what we had last year. So I think, hopefully it works out for the Falcons. And I think, the key with Fusco is it's not necessarily a massive financial commitment when you're looking sort of as the Falcons are, and we'll talk about this with the Paulson signing in a bit. But when you're sort of trying to pinch pennies a little bit and not make these big, massive financial commitments over the next couple of years, I think probably Fusco probably gave the Falcons better bang for their buck. A player like I really liked Spencer Long, and I thought if there was one guy that would be a clear upgrade at that position over Schweitzer, it would probably be Spencer Long. But you saw the contract he got with the Jets to play center there. It was like $7 million a year, and so the Falcons are basically getting Fusco at half the price and probably getting 80% the player or something like that. So I think it's a solid value signing for the Falcons. So let's move on and talk about this Logan Paulson addition, a 1-year deal, as I said. Probably don't know the terms, but I'm guessing it's a veteran minimum deal. What are your thoughts on Paulson? Do you think he's going to be penciled in as the number 2 tight end? Do you still feel like the Falcons are going to address the tight end position still in the draft?
I think it's a fair bet that he's going to be the tight end too. I tweeted about an hour ago. He can give you the same thing that Toilolo can give you, but it's going to be like at a sixth of the cost. So to me, that's a win in free agency because, I would have liked to keep Toilolo, but his price tag was way too high for the production that he gave, and it didn't seem like he was willing to take a pay cut like some of the other Falcons veterans. So that was probably the main reason why he was let go. So the fact that you're bringing in a guy with experience who, again, just like Fusco, is coming over, after being in Kyle Shanahan's playbook for a year, I mean, it's going to be an easy transition for him, I think, terminology and stuff goes. So, yeah, I mean, as a veteran, a blocking tight end, he's not going to give you a whole lot in the pass game, a couple catches here and there. I also think that Saubert still is more of a receiving tight end and is not necessarily can be relied upon, I think, as a blocker. And I think from that number 2 tight end spot, that's mainly what the Falcons have been looking for since Quinn's been here. So with that in mind, I think, it's a fair bet that he'll be the tight end too on opening day. As far as, draft-wise goes with the tight end position, I definitely think this kind of knocks that down a peg as far as their needs go there. I still think that they might look at the position on day 3 of the draft, but at this point you got 3 guys. I mean, you're still trying to develop Saubert into something. So, they could either take one on day 3 or maybe not even take one altogether. That's still up for debate, I think, at this point. I don't think the Paulson signing says anything in that regard. But, yeah, I definitely think he's tight end too, and the future of the position, the remainder of the depth chart, I mean, is up for debate, I guess.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't take tight end off the board, but I do think it gives the Falcons some flexibility that they don't necessarily have to go into the draft being like, once we get to day 2 or day 3, they're like, we have to get a tight end at this point. At that point, then that opens you up for reaches, and reaches historically are, bad. I think Paulson brings, I think he's a good run blocker. He knows the offense. He's played under Shanahan for many, many years, spent the bulk of his career playing in Kyle Shanahan-led offenses. So it's not going to be a steep learning curve for him to pick up the offense by any means. He's a capable blocker. He's a little bit more athletic than Toilolo, but he's probably got less reliable hands, which I know to people is like, how is that possible? But he hasn't been a reliable receiver the last couple of years since he left Washington. There was a couple of years where he was a solid fill-in starter for Jordan Reed in DC. But I think he gives the Falcons a solid piece. I'm not as in love with this tight end class as other people seem to be. So I kind of like this move a lot more than most, just because I think now the Falcons don't have to feel forced to take a player that, a round or two earlier than I think probably some of these guys deserve. At this point in time, I think there's really only one guy that I really feel comfortable with sort of projecting as a first or second round pick for the Falcons. And then there's a couple of guys that I wouldn't necessarily be upset if they took those guys in the third round. But I do feel like they're not necessarily either great fits or they're just kind of okay players. Like, I don't think any of those guys are on the same level as a guy like Hooper is. And I think Hooper was like, the 75th or 80th pick in his draft. So I don't feel as sort of compelled to try to draft a tight end early and feel like some pressure that this guy's going to be has a bright future in Atlanta. So day 3, I think, is still definitely a possibility if the right guy is there. But I think, at this point, I think the Falcons can be reasonably comfortable, especially if Paulson is, working under that minimum contract, that you're going to get a solid blocking to tight end, number 2 tight end, for pretty much nothing, which is, I think, again, similar to Fusco, a pretty good value for the Falcons. So let's talk about some of the players that the Falcons have visits with this week or have reportedly shown interest in. First up is Justin Bethel, the cornerback from the Arizona Cardinals, who had a visit with the team on Monday. Then we'll follow that up by talking about Pernell McPhee, the former Chicago Bears pass rusher who visited with the Falcons today. They've also been connected to Arthur Moats, the outside linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers, also a Virginia native. Went to the high school that my grandfather went to, but that's just a bonus fact. Let's talk about Bethel. And do you think Bethel comes in and competes for the nickel cornerback job, or is this really an effort of the Falcons to try to upgrade their special teams, which has certainly been under fire the last couple of years, with Bethel being a 3-time Pro Bowler in Arizona as a special teams performer?
I mean, I think Bethel would tell you straight up that, he'd be competing for that nickel spot. I don't know if that ends up happening just based off of his performances the last several years in Arizona, but I think this is mainly, first and foremost for special teams needs. I mean, he's a Pro Bowler based off of his work as a gunner on the punt coverage unit. And we know all too well how the Falcons struggled there when they started tinkering with what was working for them last year, by removing, by cutting C.J. Goodwin and obviously stripping Hardy of those duties. And you mentioned on Twitter that it's probably because of his shoulder injury. Ever since then, it was a hot mess as far as, the level of production that Keith Armstrong's accustomed to getting from those guys. So Bethel would slot in there and be an ace there, and that's where he would thrive. But I do think I read an article from one of the guys, I guess, that covers the Cardinals for ESPN, and he said where Bethel's trying to go, he's trying to get on the field on defense as well. It's not just to be a special teams ace. So he'd probably slot in at cornerback 4, but he's definitely going to be motivated. Probably going to only get a 1-year deal and hit free agency again, I would imagine. And being only that he's 27, 28, it's an opportunity to show what he's got. So if he can, beat Poole, or just add to that competition, it's all for the better, in my opinion. I mean, we know how much Dan Quinn and the coaching staff loves competition. So adding a guy like that to the mix that is definitely going to get after it on special teams and hopefully bring that dog mentality to the defense. I mean, I'm all for it. But I think with Bethel's visit and then the fact that DJ Reed was a guy that they were heavily scouting at the K-State Pro Day, someone who, kind of fits that same type of mold, a good special teams player, but also, gets after it, is a feisty, small, kind of slot corner at the next level. Kind of gets you thinking that they are looking to push Poole a little bit there in that regard. So, I think definitely it's for special teams, but I also think there is a little bit of, nickel corner role, carved out in mind for him maybe.
Yeah, I think, with those two guys, you're hoping that you sort of double dip, but I do think those two specific guys that you mentioned, Bethel and Reed, because they're primarily going to probably serve on special teams, that's really the primary focus, but it's like, the cherry on top is potentially maybe they could push Poole there. I do think Poole has a strong advocate on the coaching staff because from everything I've heard that Marquand Manuel is a big fan of Brian Poole. So I do think, there's a good chance that the Falcons don't necessarily make a major splash to try to upgrade that position, which I'm fine with. I want to see the Falcons try to get a bigger outside corner just to help out their depth, just because they don't really have a guy other than Bleedy Ray Wilson that can really fill those shoes at this current time. And I think getting a young guy there makes a lot of sense, particularly if he has that developmental upside that you think in a year or two he could potentially push for or win a starting spot. But I think with Bethel, I think it's interesting that, the Falcons visited with Paulson today, and he immediately, within like an hour of that report being that, Logan Paulson's visiting the Falcons, he signed a contract. And I think that's simply because the Falcons were like, here's the cheapest that we can pay you. And Paulson was like, I'm good with that. And I suspect that because Bethel visited on Monday and he didn't walk away with a contract, his demands are probably, as you say, he's probably looking to be a nickel cornerback somewhere and probably getting paid to be that guy. And that's, you're looking at some of the contracts that these guys signed, even on the 1-year deals this offseason. Guys like Deshaun Shedd got a 1-year, $3.5 million deal from the Lions. You had David Amerson, who signed at the time when he was presumably going to be the number 3 when Marcus Peters was still with the Chiefs. That was a 1-year, $2.25 million deal. So I imagine Bethel's probably looking at even if it is a 1-year deal, he's probably looking at, a deal that exceeds $2 million, which I don't think the Falcons should be willing to pay, just because, as you said, he is more of a special teams guy than a guy that's really going to shore up that defense. So we'll see what happens, and we'll see sort of if Bethel's market develops the way that he suspects it is. Again, I'm speculating here. I don't know. I don't have any inside details, but I'm just sort of reading the tea leaves here. And, I think he'll be definitely an upgrade on special teams, but defensively, he's got talent, he's got tools. That's why Arizona wanted him to be that number 2 guy across from Patrick Peterson the last couple of years, but he never really lived up to it in this past year, really struggled early on in the season and wound up getting benched. So I don't necessarily look at him as a high-level defensive player, but certainly a guy that has starting experience and can give you some value there alongside Bleedy Ray Wilson and certainly upgrade the special teams unit. So we'll see what happens with Bethel, but I think for the most part, I'm not expecting at this point in time that the Falcons are going to wind up signing him. So let's talk about Pernell McPhee. I know this is a guy that you're a big fan of. I've sort of, when I found out that he got cut earlier this offseason by the Bears, I was sort of secretly like, please, Falcons, sign Pernell McPhee. He's the guy. But explain to the listeners why you're such a big fan of possibly this signing.
Yeah, ever since the Falcons kind of struck out on the Michael Bennett trade, I thought of Pernell McPhee as like the perfect plan B to that. He's the same type of player where he's great against the run. He's a violent pass rusher. And he's a guy that, he's big enough where you can slide him inside and get him on the field with Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley and Grady Jarrett, and develop a nice core 4 pass rush on the nickel downs. And I mean, Pernell McPhee's only sore spot that you can point to, and it is a big one, just because you got to be on the field to make plays, is the fact that he's had an injury history, and that's kind of why the Bears let him go, because the last 2 years, I mean, knees and arm injuries, I believe, I'm not too sure, have led him to not playing a full 16. But when he's been on the field, I mean, he's graded very well, and I actually kind of did some digging and found some grades from, I think, Pro Football Focus, and if I can just, rattle some of them off. So this past year, and I'm not entirely sure on this grading system, so I mean, maybe you can give a little bit more feedback on it. Okay. But so he graded out an 11.2 overall, which I guess anything in the positives is looked on favorably. He graded out 11.2 overall, which made up 3.4 run defense, 5.3 pass rush. That was 2017. 2016, not so great, 1.8 overall, still in the positive, 0.6 run defense, 1.2 pass rush. 2015 and 2014 were his best years by far. 2015, 29.5 overall. He was 14.4 against the run, 17.4 against the pass. 2014 was 26.4. He was 4.1 against the run and a whopping 25.3 against the pass. He had 40 quarterback hurries that year. 2015, he had 48 quarterback hurries. So, I mean, we're looking at a guy when he's healthy. That's the type of player that, the Falcons had in mind with Claiborne. And Claiborne, at times lived up to it, but a lot of it was inflated for, that one big 6-sack game. But he's the type of guy, can set a hard edge, can rotate inside in the nickel. And also what I've heard is he has a great personality, and the media will eat him up, and that would pair nicely with Tack McKinley. So that's kind of got me excited a little bit too. So, I mean, all in all, I think this is the type of plan B to that Michael Bennett miss that I think would just fit perfectly for what Dan Quinn wants, starting at strong side defensive end. And then, like I said, in the nickel, you're getting him on the field with Tack, with Grady, and with Vic, or Vic and Tack and Grady. So...
yeah, I think that's a good way of framing it. And for those of you that are more used to Pro Football Focus's 100-point or 90-point grades, basically the thing that all you need to know is McPhee's never graded lower than a 74.5 in his entire career in Baltimore and Chicago. So he's always graded out as a good starter or a really Pro Bowl caliber sort of player. I think with McPhee, it'll be interesting because I think you're right. He checks pretty much every box that the Falcons would potentially want checked for their defensive line, to be able to play that inside role in the nickel, which we didn't see a ton of Claiborne do last year just because they were sort of slowly bringing Tack along, and then Vic Beasley missed time. And so it really wasn't until like the last month of the season when we started to see Claiborne start to kick inside and try to get Tack, Claiborne, Grady, and Vic on the field at the same time, as much as we saw earlier in the year. But I think McPhee would sort of probably be pushed into that role. I do wonder a little bit if he's going to potentially play that strong side defensive end role that's been vacated by Derek Shelby, just because I think over the last couple of years he's tried to slim down a little bit to be a little bit more of that 3-4 outside linebacker that the Bears wanted him to be. And I don't know if he's as bulky as he was a couple of years ago when he was playing with the Ravens. But, I think ideally he probably need to bulk up a little bit to get back to that role. But I think for the most part, the Falcons would really be focusing on his ability as a nickel and whatever he gives in the base defense. I think there's a real possibility that the Falcons try to put Jack Crawford there this year in year 2, particularly if they can upgrade that D-tackle spot in the draft. With a couple of pieces, and a guy like McPhee would be a good start in free agency. But as you said, I think McPhee checks a lot of the boxes, and the only concern you really have to have is the durability issues. He's missed, 10 games in the last 2 years. So, that's not a ridiculous number. It's not Sam Bradford or anything like that, but it is one of those things where you do have to be concerned, and I do think if you do sign him, I would expect the Falcons to try to have him with a more limited role, which may be a part-time nickel player, just so they don't have to sort of wear him down, I guess. So we'll see. But I agree with you. As far as possible options past the Michael Bennett signing, in terms of the Falcons trying to maximize their pass rush potential without having to spend gobs and gobs of money, I do think McPhee is probably the best option that the Falcons could possibly require in free agency at this point.
Yeah, and I think a couple other points on him is just, Falcons are more likely than not going to get a defensive tackle early in this draft, and depending on who that is, you're not going to be able to really count on them, I don't think, much early on, at least from a nickel standpoint, rushing inside. So you need to find an interior pass rusher, I think, a veteran one, so that you can have Vic, Tack, and Grady all on the field at the same time. Whereas especially if Daron Payne's the guy that falls them and they end up taking him. I mean, we talked about Daron Payne a little bit earlier today. Daron Payne is right now more of an elite run stuffer. He's not. He's got a ways to go as far as a pass rusher goes. So you're more likely than not maybe going to have to take him off the field early on until he develops that. So a guy like McPhee is the type of player that can slot in. Jack Crawford will probably get some inside reps in pass rushing downs, but I don't know how much. So again, in that regard, you need to find someone that fits that Claiborne/Michael Bennett role, and I don't know if there's too many other guys on the market left like Pernell McPhee that can do that. And then from a contract standpoint, I think I don't think he has the leverage to break the bank right now based off his injury history, and I think a deal that he's going to expect is going to have a lot of per game roster bonuses worked in, which aren't necessarily likely to be earned if it's for a full. Well, most of those work on a game by game basis. So cap wise, if he doesn't pan out, it's not going to ruin your cap. And I'm not sure if he would get any more than a 1-year deal. I'd like to see him get maybe a 2-year deal, but it all depends on how the team feels and other teams feel about him health-wise. Because I know a lot of Bears fans believe he's washed and done, but I still think there's some left in the tank.
Yeah, I think the ideal situation that you would hope for from a money standpoint is you'd probably be able to get him on a similar deal that the Falcons got Adrian Claiborne on 3 years ago, which was a 1-year, $3 million deal.
Yeah.
So I think that would be ideal. I mean, if you have to go to like $4 or $5 million, I think that's workable. Obviously, the Falcons have just about that much in cap space. So, I think whether the Falcons land McPhee, I think will depend heavily on sort of what his price point is. But I certainly don't expect the Falcons to get him on a veteran minimum deal. So they're going to have to pay a little bit. But if it's only $3 million, I think that's a good move for the Falcons, and that still gives them some room to add a couple of other low-level guys in the sort of Logan Paulson price range as opposed to the Fusco McPhee price range. But we'll see. Let's finish things up talking about the possible newcomers. What are your thoughts on the report that the Falcons have shown interest in Steelers outside linebacker Arthur Moats?
I think Moats would be kind of like Bethel, more for special teams, more for depth. With Vic Beasley, Dan Quinn saying that Vic Beasley is going to focus on defensive end. I think you need to find a backup Sam so that report could actually hold some merit and not switch Vic back if Devondre got hurt. So I think Arthur would be the ideal candidate to be a backup Sam based off of his time as a 3-4 outside linebacker with the Steelers. But ideally, I think you don't want to see Moats playing too much. Again, you just want to see him on special teams and just provide some depth. And I guess he does have some versatility where he can slot inside, but at his age, and I think he's probably lost a step or two. He's not going to be great in coverage, and you don't want to see him there. So Yeah, all in all, I would just think he would be a solid depth piece behind Devondre with some experience, and again, he'd be a core special teamer.
Yeah, the Moats interest is interesting to me, but just because I think he's a solid football player, but I don't look at him as a great fit in what the Falcons want their guys to be typically. Because if they like linebackers, they like really fast guys. That's not really Moats at this point. With pass rushers, you would assume that they would want someone with a little bit more size there, and that's not really Moats. He's about the same size as James Harrison. About 6 foot, 245 pounds. So it'll be an interesting sort of way to see where the Falcons sort of fit him in if they do wind up signing him. I do think you're right. Probably as that Sam linebacker probably makes the most sense, just because I don't really see what he, as a defensive end, what he's bringing to the table that you don't already have in Vic, Brooks, Reed, and Tack. But he is much more comfortable rushing the quarterback than he is necessarily dropping in coverage. So that's the interesting thing. I think really at this point, not to say that he's not a good player. And again, I think if he was playing in a 3-4 defense, this would be a different conversation. But I do think really, as far as his projectability in this scheme, he's really just a Philip Wheeler type of guy, which is okay as your Sam linebacker. We went through that in 2015 or 2016, whenever it was. So that's fine. If the Falcons were really interested in finding a backup Sam linebacker, they could give my guy O'Brien Schofield a call or something like that. But we'll see what happens with Moats, or if the interest is real, or it's maybe just his agent putting something out there to try to get the Steelers to up their offer. Who knows at this point? But we'll see what happens. Let's talk a little bit about the losses that the Falcons had in free agency. Even though they've added a couple of guys, they lost some huge pieces. We've talked about a few of them already. In Adrian Claiborne, they also lost Dontari Poe to the Carolina Panthers, and they lost Taylor Gabriel to the Chicago Bears. Which one of those losses, Matt, do you feel like the Falcons are going to be feeling the most in 2018?
I think it's definitely Dontari Poe. That's the biggest hole right now, gaping hole in this roster, is that starting defensive tackle next to Grady Jarrett. Poe is a guy that played over 70% of snaps, was effective in the nickel and the base, solid veteran. He didn't wow us. We probably all had our expectations of what he was going to bring a little bit too high, but he was above average player still for the Falcons, and I'm glad for him. He got the pay increase he wanted, the long-term deal he wanted, but it was not something that the Falcons could ever have fitted in their budget. But yeah, they're definitely going to feel his loss. Just again, he was a veteran. He was someone that just plug and play, and right next to Grady formed a nice tandem in both the run and the pass. So he's the one that we're hoping this draft class provides the long-term answer, but until you see it happen, to trust a rookie in that spot is always tough. So it's going to come with growing pains, but it's definitely Dontari Poe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair pick. I think I would probably argue that Claiborne had the most impact last year in terms of what he did for the team, but and then you could argue because of his pass rushing ability and that being a little bit more important than Poe, you could make that case, but I wouldn't necessarily split hairs with you. You also throw in the fact that we're going to face Poe twice this year, so we might actually feel that loss a little bit more directly, particularly because if you assume Carolina's defensive line, he plugs right into that Star Lotulelei spot at nose tackle at that one technique, at left defensive tackle, he's going to be facing Brandon Fusco quite a bit this year, so we could definitely be feeling that pretty whatever that word is. But I'll give a little shout out to Taylor Gabriel. I do think, even though he was not well utilized in the offense, I do feel like he was probably the biggest loss to the 2016 team. So because of where he went from, literally, if you look at DVOA, the best wide receiver in the NFL in 2016 to, pretty much an afterthought in 2017. So obviously, because we already experienced the massive loss from Taylor Gabriel, we don't assume that that's going to be another loss. But yeah, I think all three of those guys will do well in their new stops, particularly Gabriel. Well, certainly he'll do better than I think he did in 2017 in Atlanta, and we'll see about Poe. Just one last thought on Poe. You said we had our expectations too high, and I think you're right. I think we all sort of expected Poe to come here and basically be Snacks Harrison and just be this black hole in the middle of our defense and just hoovering up blocks and freeing up guys and being this dominant force in the middle of the defensive line that commanded double teams and doing all that type of stuff. He wasn't that guy, but he was a good player. I think people don't realize that, as a pass rusher, he was arguably better than Grady Jarrett was last year, just from a production standpoint. And while he wasn't necessarily that dominant run defender, he was a solid run defender. He's always been a solid run defender. But he's just not necessarily making the one-on-one plays that a guy like Grady Jarrett does because of his disruptive capability. But I do think Poe is sort of underrated in a lot of ways, just because now people are like, oh, he wasn't that good and he was overrated and all that type of stuff. And it's just like, he was good. He just wasn't as good as we all hoped and wanted him to be, which we, as Matt said, probably didn't have realistic expectations. We were just kind of hoping that single-handedly Dontari Poe would uplift our defensive line to the best unit in the NFL. He didn't do that, but that doesn't mean that he did not play well for the Falcons this past season.
I think it's also kind of interesting that Poe, and we had discussions about this. Poe played a lot more 3-tech than I had ever thought he would with the Falcons. I thought they were going to plug him as the 1-tech and, like you said, be a Snacks Harrison and eat blocks and allow the linebackers to fly around and make plays. And that wasn't the case. I mean, they had Grady playing that role more than Poe, and now you say Poe's going to go to Carolina, and I agree. He's probably going to be the 1-tech there, where Kawan Short's going to be the 3-tech, and is that are we going to see Poe play even better than he did in Atlanta, or was Dan Quinn right to have him at the 3-tech? That's going to be something I'm interested to see how Carolina utilizes him and how he plays in that role. Because, when he did get 1-tech snaps in Atlanta, that seemed to be where he thrived the most, and the linebackers did make plays, and he made plays in the backfield. So it's kind of interesting to maybe look for, with his time in Carolina. And then as far as Claiborne, just one point I wanted to make on him, because I saw the contract terms a couple of days ago, and he's only on the hook for $3 million in 2018 with New England, and I mean, that's something Atlanta easily could have fit under their cap instead of going out and signing a Pernell McPhee. So that tells me that they wanted to get either younger at the position or more versatile, because we know Adrian can only play on that one side due to his arm issues. So I think Falcons, I mean, they addressed it, at the Combine, that they were going to let those two guys hit free agency, and they knew they weren't going to be back. But, I mean, it just shows even more that they didn't even want to try to match that offer. They were like, all right, we're moving on, and sorry, but it is what it is, type of thing.
Yeah, well, and obviously we'll be looking forward to seeing how the Falcons address those holes, whether it's in free agency with a guy like Pernell McPhee or in the draft. I think we all sort of assume that between Poe and Gabriel, they will try to find replacements in the draft. The question is, with Claiborne and his immediate value as a pass rusher, as we mentioned with Pernell McPhee, that you can get somebody there that can immediately plug and play. Looking at the Falcons' unsigned free agents at this point in time, is there anybody on that list of guys that the Falcons so far have let walk that you would want to see back, that you would rank above the others?
I think the one that I've always been talking about and assuming that he's going to maybe be back is Ataba Rubin. I think just having his presence, I mean, when they brought him in, you could see him out on the field. He popped on plays. So just to have him be there as a veteran presence, knowing you're probably going to bring in at least one, if not two, defensive tackles or defensive linemen in this class. So to have a guy like that be able to mentor him in the role and has been, playing under Dan Quinn for many years, that's someone I'd like to see brought back. As far as some of the others, I think, they're extremely thin at linebacker right now with really just having the top 3 starters on their roster. So, I expect and would hope that, at least one of, if not 2 of, whether it's Reynolds or Tripp, if he's fully healed from his concussion issues, or, Sean Weatherspoon, or Kamal Ishmael. So, I'd like to see at least one. Wouldn't hate if they brought a second one back on a Vetman type deal. As far as some of the others, I mean, they still need a fullback. I know Derek Coleman, didn't set the world on fire. He's no Patrick DeMarco, that's for sure, as far as a blocker goes. But, I mean, he did provide something on special teams, and I mean, that continuity on special teams is important, I think. So that would probably be the third one, but, I mean, that's a stretch. Maybe they'll look for Zach Line. Zach Line's still out there as a free agent. Maybe they'll consider him, but, I mean, they need to do something at fullback, and using a draft resource on one isn't maybe the best use of draft resources. So.
Yeah, I'm there with you at drafting a fullback. There are some decent fullbacks in this draft, but, it's just not really worth it.
Maybe we don't need another Brady Ewing again.
Yeah. My guys are Teron Ward and Sherrod Neesman. I was shocked to see the Falcons let Neesman go. Ward, I figured they wouldn't necessarily offer him a restricted tender, but I figured they would find a way to get him back, like on a 2-year deal for the veteran minimum both years. That hasn't been the case, so presumably, I don't know, he's walking out the door. So those are the 2 guys that I was just like, I don't get why are you creating a hole at a spot that you didn't need to create a hole for. So, yeah, those would be the 2 guys that, like, everybody else I'm just kind of like, yeah, whatever. Like, Rubens would probably top the list of the other guys, just because I think he's a solid sort of rotational piece that wouldn't be expensive. But everybody else I could be like, yeah, I wouldn't be like upset if they re-signed him or anything, but I could take him or leave him really at this point. Like, Kamal Ishmael's a solid backup, but I feel like the Falcons could draft a guy in the 6th round and get probably more value out of that player than possibly Ishmael. So it is what it is. We'll see what happens. I'm a little surprised that some of these guys, like you mentioned, the linebackers and Rubin, didn't get re-signed, at least one of those guys. So we'll see what the Falcons do. All right, let's move on and answer these mailbag questions. We got a bunch from people today. Brian at your homie Brian asked, do you think Michael Bennett or Richard Sherman would have been a good fit here considering their price tag, or do you think we are better off drafting and relying on Dan Quinn and Marquand Manuel coaching them up?
I mean, Michael Bennett would have been a fit for sure, but I guess the price tag, they didn't want to part with that 4th, and it's hard to blame them when the last couple of years that 4th round pick has been a key contributor on this team. So long term, they got a long term vision, and you can't fault them for that. So it is what it is there. I mean, Richard Sherman, the money would have never made sense. From a player, of course, you'd love to have a player the caliber of Richard Sherman on your football team, but again, Falcons were strapped tight to the cap, have been pretty much all off season, so it would have never worked. But sure, you would have loved to have both of those guys on the roster in a perfect world.
Yeah, I think Bennett is a no-brainer, as you said. Like, he's obviously would have been a great fit, and at the price that you would have had him, what was it, like $3 million that he would have been on the books for their salary cap this year with the roster bonus. Like, that's definitely worth it. With Sherman, I like Richard Sherman a lot, but I think with what the Falcons need at that position, they need an outside corner that's good in man coverage. And at this point in Sherman's career, he's definitely an outside corner, but coming off the Achilles injury, like, whatever man coverage abilities that you thought were there before, which weren't amazing, but were, obviously good, probably aren't going to be there at this point. And so it just didn't make a whole lot of sense for the Falcons to necessarily pursue Sherman, even though, in a world where he would have basically signed like a 1 year, $2 million contract, then it's definitely worth it at that point just to kick the tires on it and see, like, maybe you gamble on that and hit big on it. But given what he is at this point, or what you think he's going to be this season, and the Falcons sort of need at that position, they need a young guy with size that can play high level man coverage, as opposed to a guy that's an old guy with size that's really a high level zone corner that Sherman is at this point. So I feel comfortable with them drafting a cornerback for the most part. And, the defensive lineman, I feel good about whoever they probably will wind up picking. I didn't love the Takk McKinley selection at the time. If you had asked me 15 minutes after or let me say 15 seconds, because the minute he started, saying "find me later," that turned the page on my thoughts on Takk. But I think long term, whoever the Falcons pick at the D line probably will be better than what Bennett will be, 3-4 years from now. But certainly, probably over the next year or two, Bennett probably would have been a significantly bigger contributor to the Falcons' defensive line than whoever the Falcons wind up drafting. All right, next question comes from Young Zach, at Young Zach on Twitter. How confident are you in the Falcons' current D-line personnel to generate pass rush and stop the run? Who do you think will emerge as the number 3 pass rusher? Please don't say Reed, and the anchor in the middle of the line.
Yeah, I'm very confident in the 3 horses that they got. 3 stars, Grady, Takk, and Vic. I tweeted already, barring any injuries, I think Vic and Takk can both be double-digit sack guys next year. I think people are sleeping on Vic, and when they started sleeping on him at the start of his second year, calling him a bust, that's when he turned it on. So I think he's motivated to kind of write the script on his career and turn it around again and have another big year. So I'm confident in those 3 guys. Jack Crawford's another one that's being overlooked. I think we saw some things where, featuring him inside with that quick burst, I think he can be a disruptive player, as a rotational guy. From there, though, I should talk about Brooks Reed, since he's also part of the mix, and that nasty spin move that's always so close, but the quarterback always gets it out of his hands just before he reaches him. I think Reed, accepting the pay cut, kudos to him, because he didn't have to do that. Obviously, he probably wouldn't have gotten what he's getting paid now if he didn't, but to be a team player like that, you got to credit that. But then also, just from a stopping the run standpoint, him and Shelby were 2 of the best at that last year. So I think he definitely is going to bring that, and then occasionally he'll give you a little bit in the pass rush department. So to ultimately answer who's the number 3 pass rusher on this team, he might not even be on the roster right now, depending on who they get in the draft. Right now, I'd say probably Grady Jarrett after Vic and Takk. But if they get someone like maybe Taven Bryan or Maurice Hurst, if he somehow falls, if teams are scared of his medicals, that could end up being the number 3 pass rusher in 2018.
Yeah, Zach, you used the word confident, and I don't have a ton of confidence. I have optimism. So I would sort of play semantics there a little bit and say I'm optimistic that the Falcons' current D-line personnel will be able to generate pass rush, and sort of judging it by, like, if we get into the postseason, and those guys will have a significant impact on the outcome of that game, which I don't think we've seen the last couple of years outside of Brooks Reed taking over that Seahawk game in 2016. And certainly Grady Jarrett playing lights out in the Super Bowl, but other than Grady Jarrett and a couple of plays by Dwight Freeney, you didn't see a whole lot from the rest of the Falcons front. And we didn't see a ton from them in that Eagles game, and I don't really recall them doing a whole lot in that Rams game either. I know Takk made a couple plays, I think. But, in terms of, like, flipping the script like the Eagles did to us and us doing that to another team, no, I'm not that confident that, the current guys and whoever they add in the draft is going to become that type of unit. this upcoming season. But I am optimistic to a certain extent. In terms of who's going to be that number 3 pass rusher, I'm assuming you're thinking more along the lines of edge rusher. I do think it's going to be Brooks Reed, more than likely. If we do wind up getting a guy like Taven Bryan, then maybe he would be sort of the de facto guy, because you could see him getting some of those Shelby reps in the base and whatnot. But I think primarily you'll be looking at Brooks Reed getting the bulk of the backup snaps when Tack and Vic Beasley need a breather at that DN spot on passing downs. And the anchor in the middle line, I suspect the Falcons are going to draft that at some point. I thought they might bring back a guy like Rubin to sort of be a stopgap until they found the player in the draft. But honestly, I think somewhere in the 3rd, 4th round range, you can find that type of player and get a solid piece there. Not necessarily a guy that's going to come in and light the world on fire by any means, but give you solid reps in run defense, as we saw last year with guys like Dalvin Tomlinson and Devon Godshaw in Miami and New York and whatnot. So I do certainly think there are plenty of guys in this draft class that can provide that. But, I think really right now the Falcons are really looking more towards the long-term building. So in terms of 2018 confidence, I don't have a ton of confidence that we're going to see a great pass rush this year. But, if and when Vic gets his act together, if and when Tack sort of comes into his own, which typically for pass rushers comes in year 3, and Grady Jarrett continues to make strides, and whoever the Falcons add this offseason has a year or 2 under the belt, 2019, I think certainly could be a year where everything comes together and coalesces into a top-tier pass rush for the Falcons. But right now, I'm not necessarily expecting us to rack up 50-plus sacks this upcoming season. So we'll see what happens. ATL Sports 404. Can Vic Beasley be a DE full-time, base and nickel snaps? I feel like this coming season will be a crucial one when determining what his best fit is on the team.
Yeah, I like this question a lot, and it's something that I've kind of thought about quite a bit. Thought about it even before last season. Because with Vic Beasley's, you're gonna have to make a decision. I believe in May, right, on his 5th-year option. Is this the year for that? Correct?
Yes, I think they haven't officially exercised it, but I'm pretty sure that we already heard that they plan to do it, which makes sense.
Right, absolutely. So you got him for 2 more years, but I'm always thinking beyond that, and most GMs usually are. And if you're gonna think of Vic Beasley as just a nickel pass rusher, which again, nickel pass rushers nowadays means something a lot different than a couple years ago. When you're in the nickel 60 to 70% of times, he's basically a starter or full-time player as it is. But I always thought of Vic as growing into that Leo role, that pass rusher, that guy that can also, though, not be a liability on the weak side of this defense. So this really is the year. Whether we realize that or not, I think, and with Dan Quinn saying he wants to focus Vic solely at defensive end, I think we are going to see that. He's going to answer that one way or another. And I'm hoping he can, because, I think we've had a rotation in our defensive line since Quinn's been there, but I kind of want to see them just roll with 4 or 5 guys and kind of let your best guys be there that are the best at the run and defending the pass. And hopefully Vic is in that mix with Tack and with Grady. I think those guys are kind of locked in because we know what Grady is. His ceiling is a Pro Bowl, potentially all-pro type player. And Tack showed he can make plays both against the run and obviously getting after the quarterback. So I don't think there's any worry there. It's just Vic, occasionally against the run from the defensive end spot has always been kind of maybe a little bit of a liability, you could say. So I don't know. I don't know if we can answer this question right now, but hopefully 2018 does bring that answer, and I'm hoping the answer is yes. And Vic and Tack are the guys patrolling the edge for the next 5 years, hopefully at least.
Yeah, this is. I think you're right. ATL Sports 404. This is a crucial season for Vic. because, like, this is going to sound like hating on Vic, but I kind of think Vic Beasley is Bruce Irvin, and I'm fine with that. Like, I don't think he needs to be more, but I do think has always been this expectation with Vic Beasley that he was going to be this John Abraham type of impact pass rusher. And after his second, and that was one of the reasons why going into his first year, his rookie year, and coming out of it, not, hitting those double-digit sacks that a lot of people were expecting him, you started hearing people call him a bust already. Then, his second season, I think because of his production, I think there was kind of a backlash to the backlash, and I think people tended to overhype how good he was his second year. Obviously he was very productive and good. Don't get me wrong. You can't be terrible and lead the NFL in sacks. But I do think people sort of pushed him into this stratosphere as a pass rusher that he wasn't really deserving of being, as this elite guy. And so then now you had the backlash to the backlash to the backlash when he didn't necessarily live up to that hype this past season. And I do think, this year is going to be an interesting one for Vic, just because I think the expectations are that, last year was an aberration. He'll bounce back and be more like it's 2016 for him. And, I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic that he'll start to put things together and be a little bit more of a refined and technical pass rusher than he's shown over the last 3 years. And if he does, I think, that would be a huge boost to not only his production, but also his ability to make plays snap to snap. But honestly, I do think he's a linebacker. I think the Falcons are still holding out hope that they can turn him into this top-tier pass rusher, but I honestly think he's more of a linebacker that can dabble as a pass rusher and give you valuable reps there, certainly, and be a good contributor there. But I don't think he's this Khalil Mack, Von Miller type of guy that people want him to be. I think he's more of a Bruce Irvin type. And we'll see. I could certainly be, sitting here 6 months from now or 9 months from now being completely wrong about that, and I hope I am. But I do think, in terms of where Vic is going to be, I'm perfectly comfortable with him being Bruce Irvin. He doesn't have to be more than that to me. But we'll see what happens this year.
I think too. I mean, Vic's first couple years, he was the only guy that teams really had to worry about. And now, I mean, you can argue and say that he's probably the third guy on the scouting report, with Grady probably being number one, and Tack with his rookie season turning some heads. I mean, he might be number two that teams kind of look to guard against. So Vic might have the benefit now, I think, of getting some more one-on-ones as opposed to in years prior where he got chipped quite a bit off the edge. So, I mean, that's something else I'm going to be looking for, and I think other people should be looking for too, is the fact that I think now there's three guys that, strike fear into defenses potentially, or offenses, excuse me, and Vic Beasley might be third on that list, so that might open up more opportunities for him, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation similar to what I just answered the question, where, like, I'm optimistic, but I'm not necessarily confident that Vic's going to have this breakout season as a pass rusher. So that's sort of where I'm at. I think he's a good player. I just think the expectation, I think part of it was because the Falcons went so long without investing in their pass rush that when we drafted Vic Beasley, there was so high level of expectations on him, and at this point in time, I'm not necessarily confident that he's going to live up to those expectations. I just think, at some point people need to just potentially, let's say potentially, like I'm not saying this is definitive, but I think at some point people just need to realize, like, he's a good player, but he's just not the player. It's kind of like with Poe, like, good player, but not necessarily this dominant force of a player that people hoped him to be. And I think the problem is that people have a tendency to be like, oh, he's not when we drafted him in the top 10, we expected this. And it's kind of the same thing you see with Jake Matthews haters. It's like Jake Matthews is a perfectly fine to good starting left tackle, probably top 15, but probably not top 10. And, there's a lot of people that think, oh, for a guy that was the seventh pick in the draft, he should be like an elite left tackle, and it's like he's not, but he's still a good player. And I kind of feel like Vic's the same way. Like Vic Beasley, people think, oh, he should be a double-digit sack guy every year, and I'm like, he's probably like a 6 to 8 sack guy, which is fine. That's still a good player, but it's just not this, force of nature that I think a lot of people want him to be. So that's really what I'm saying.
Would you give him a second contract then, Vic Beasley?
I mean, it depends. I mean, pass rushers get paid so much, and I think someone would look at his resume and be like, "Let's give this guy."
That's the thing, though. I don't think you're not paying him as a pass rusher anymore, really. So it's not like Jake Matthews, where he's a left tackle. He's going to get paid like one. Vic Beasley, it's a totally different argument. It seems like.
Well, I look. You look at the market for these guys, and if I'm Vic Beasley, I'm like, I should be able to get $12 million a year on the open market, either from a 4-3 team or a 3-4 team. Somebody like, I think Vic Beasley. If the scenario I'm envisioning is Vic Beasley hits the open market and some 3-4 team who, like the Steelers or a team like that drops their guys in the coverage and has them rush the quarterback, is going to sign Vic Beasley, and he's going to turn into this prolific player that everybody was like, why couldn't he be that in Atlanta? And it's like, well, because they refused to ever drop him into space. But, it depends. Like this year, I think sort of depends, how well he plays this year is going to determine, I think, go a long way to determine whether he gets a second contract in Atlanta or the Falcons sort of let him hit the market and see what happens.
I agree.
All right, next question comes from Mave2124. He asks, free agency-wise, I don't see us signing anything outside of a blocking tight end, fullback, or special teams player. Do you agree?
I definitely agree about that blocking tight end part, as evidenced by Paulson's signing. But as far as fullback special teams players go, I mean, we talked about it earlier. Bethel and Moats, I believe, would fit that special teams player spot. Fullback's a little bit tougher to break down. There's not a whole lot of names left. The Raiders and the Cowboys basically swapped cornerbacks this past week, or fullbacks this past week. I know the one that's going to Dallas was a big fan. You were a big fan of, Aaron.
All of the above.
Yeah, the next Mahaley, maybe. Obi Mahaley. Zach Line is out there, I guess, and that's an intriguing option. Former Saints fullback. I don't know how responsible you'd want to give him credit for their resurgence in the backfield, but I think he had something to do with it. I wouldn't be mad if they brought back Derek Coleman. Again, he led the team in special teams tackles. He was a Pro Bowl special teamer because of that. That continuity is important, and the continuity on offense would, I think, be important to bring him back. And so I see them. That's the way I predict them going. But if they brought in Line or maybe someone is not on my radar, that would be cool too. But yeah, I mean, they're not going to do too many more splash moves. Hopefully, Pernell McPhee would be the last of them. I mean, that would be great. I think that would kind of complete and all you could really expect for based off their cap situation from this free agency period. But other than that, yeah, I don't see a whole lot else.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I don't get what this team is doing with the fullback position these last 2 offseasons. I don't get it. Like, obviously Keith Smith, went to Oakland and probably got a better.
He got DeMarco contract. Money.
Yeah. So like, I get why he didn't go, but why the Falcons didn't call up the Raiders immediately after that and be like, let's get Olawale. I don't know, but I think the Cowboys gave up a 5th and got a 6th in return for that, so maybe he was out of their trade range. At this point, it's Zach Line or Derek Coleman, or you're drafting a guy. I think Zach Line is clearly an upgrade, not necessarily a world-class fullback, but certainly better than what Coleman has been the last couple of years. As you said, if they brought back Coleman on a veteran minimum contract, like, I wouldn't complain about it because it makes perfect sense given what's out there. But it just seems like this team is so reluctant to go out and upgrade this fullback position or maintain their fullback position. If you go back to last year, and I have no idea why. It just is like they just have this mental block. Like, we're not giving a fullback more than veteran minimum money, which is, if you want to make that stand, then fine, make that stand, but then don't go out and use a fullback to the degree that you're actually using a fullback. So I don't get it, but maybe by the time we get to May after the draft or something, I'll be like, okay, now it makes a lot more sense. But we'll see what happens.
I mean, that's why I was such a big advocate for Trey Burton, because someone like that can kind of kill two birds with one stone, being an inline tight end, but can also duel as that H-back lead blocker that he did a couple times for the Eagles. Would have been great. So maybe they're looking at an H-back type guy that you're not just drafting a fullback, you're also drafting a pseudo tight end on day 3. I mean, that could be my only guess, that maybe they're looking at something like that. But I mean, it's not like they showed any interest in. Well, he was way out of their price range anyways, but it's not like they showed any interest in a guy like that. So who knows?
Well, I mean, Ed Dixon did dabble a little bit as a fullback with Carolina occasionally. He wasn't really good at that, but like, he dabbled at times. So it made sense why they might have had Dixon higher on their free agent rankings, and I think a lot of people would have guessed going into the offseason. But who knows? Right now I'm just hoping that they sign Zach Line at this point, so I can be like, hey, you did something at that position. You tried to make a move, but it just seems like they're just like, oh yeah, fullback is like the 53rd spot on our roster, because that's basically how they treated it last offseason. And so far, a week into free agency, it does seem like that's going to be the case. So we'll see what happens. ATL Sports 404 asked, the Falcons have been linked to some edge players in free agency, but I think D tackle is a much bigger need. Is there anyone on the market who the Falcons could realistically target?
I mean, in a perfect world, I'd love for them to get Hankins, but he was getting paid close to $10 million a year with the Colts. Should have never been cut from them to begin with. He's likely going to get at least what Daquan Jones from Tennessee got, 3 years, $21 million, so about $7 per year. That's still too much. Atlanta can't afford that. The one other name, and his market seems to continue to dwindle each year, is Benny Logan. I'd love him as a run stuffing one tech. I'm not sure what he's going to get paid. I mean, he got paid last year $8 million on a 1-year deal, similar to Poe. Maybe he's now down to a $5 million a year player, maybe even less. Then maybe it's an option, but I don't know. They didn't show any interest in him last year when he was available to them, so I doubt they see him as a fit, but I could be wrong. So not as far as the free agent market goes for defensive tackles, I think the draft is the way to go for that. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of guys out there that I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, if the Falcons signed him on a cheap deal, I'd be cool with that. Alan Branch, I think kicking the tires and see if any 2016 Alan Branch is still left there. He could be that run plugger, be, a bigger, if he's half the player he was 2 years ago, he would be a significant upgrade to that spot over a guy like Ataba Rubin. Tom Johnson, he's another older guy that's been a really solid pass rusher in both Minnesota and New Orleans the last couple of years. I wouldn't definitely mind him. He could be that sort of Claiborne interior type of pass rusher for a year or so at the right price. You're right. Logan and Hankins are clearly heads and heels above the rest. Obviously, Sue is out there, but we know, and really on all three of those guys' cases, they're probably not necessarily in the Falcons' price range, because they're all going to be looking for starting D-tackle money, and in the case of Sue, looking at small Greek god money in terms of what he's going to get paid. So we'll see. Carl Klug, I think, could sort of be that situational pass rusher interior guy, and maybe play a little of that base defensive end spot a little bit, dabble there. Other than that, there's not necessarily anybody that really jumps out to me that I've seen that I'm like, oh yeah, the Falcons should definitely sign. Like, I was a huge fan of Dayton Jones, like, when he came out. He was the guy I wanted us to draft back in 2013 before we traded up to Desmond Trufant. He's been a solid NFL player, but he's played outside linebacker, he's played D tackle, he's played DN. So he gives you some versatility, certainly, to sort of plug and play with him at a multitude of spots. So I wouldn't be opposed to signing him or something if you can get him on a cheap deal. But for the most part, I think you're right. It's really going to be the draft where you can really load up on D tackles on some really cheap contracts based off of the rookie deals. All right, Brian, at your homeboy, Brian asks, do you expect our defense to reach or come close to reach the 2013 Seahawks or 2000 Ravens?
No. I mean, I expect them to be. They can be another top 10 defense, top 5 defense, but I think with those that you're talking historically great defenses, and that I don't know. I think we're beginning to see what this team, like the ceiling on what this defense can be. I don't know if they can like go much higher. Maybe like you said in 2019 when they start, when they have a couple of these rookies that they're going to bring in start hitting their form, maybe. But yeah, I don't know. I'd like to keep my expectations somewhat reasonable, and I don't know if that's necessarily reasonable.
Yeah, I think the next great hurdle is going to be the pass rush. So, if you feel like the pass rush can be a great unit, then it's possible, I wouldn't necessarily go to the level, as Matt said, to like top 5 all time, but certainly top 5 2018.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant by that. If it was,
yeah, no, I know what you were meaning.
All
like,
right. Okay. Yeah.
Like those two units, Seahawks and the Ravens, are top 5 all time. Top 5 this year. Yeah, that's plausible if you think the pass rush is going to make a big leap forward, because we know the linebacker core hopefully will be a little bit more consistent, play like they did in December as opposed to what they were doing in September throughout this upcoming season. We know the secondary is really good, so it's really just how the front performs, which will sort of guide the ceiling of this defense. So, no, I don't think they're going to come close to reaching those units, but I certainly think they can be a good defense this year. The next question is on the same note from Brian. He says, how well do you think the 2016 Falcons offense would do against a defense like the 85 Bears or the 2000 Ravens? Let's say the game takes place in the Georgia Dome. Do you think we had the creativity to pick apart those defenses? I think we could if we were at home.
Wow, that's a doozy. I can't really. Definitely wasn't around when the 85 Bears were playing, so I can't comment too much on them. Obviously I've seen clips and whatnot, but 2000 Ravens, they had like Tony Saragusa in the middle, right?
Sam Adams.
Who was their edge guys?
Mike McCarthy.
Because that's my biggest worry is how is the offensive line going to hold up against those guys? But I don't remember them having too many like amazing edge rushers. Obviously Ray Lewis was.
Peter Bulwer.
He was an edge guy, or he's a inside linebacker.
I don't remember.
Yeah, that's tough. The secondary, I think, was. Man, I can picture who he.
Yeah. Their top pass rushers were Rob Burnett, Peter Bulwer, and Michael McCrary.
Okay.
And their secondary was Rod Woodson and Kim Herring were the safeties, and Chris McAllister and Dwayne Stocks were the corners.
Man, that'd be fun. I'd also like to put, not to change this question around, but say you had Kyle Shanahan as the offensive coordinator of the 2012 offense with Roddy, Julio, and Tony Gonzalez against the 2000 Ravens. Now that would be, because not that the 2016 Falcons didn't have a great, arsenal of weapons, but it is becoming more and more apparent that Kyle Shanahan did make a lot of those guys. Taylor Gabriel, obviously, Mohamed Sanu. Using Tevin Coleman out of the backfield. I don't know. I think a lot of that's Kyle Shanahan, and not necessarily just any coordinator can do that. But to have the weapons that the 2012 offense had, which I would say was substantially better, but having a better play caller as opposed to Dirk Cutter, I think that would be a fun matchup, and I think they would have a better chance of competing against the 2000 Ravens than the 2016 offense would.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see why you say that, just because you look at Roddy in his prime, Julio coming into his prime, Tony still having plenty of tread left on the tires. I don't know if there's anything else about that 2012 offense though that I think would be that. Like, I mean, maybe Kyle Shanahan.
I think the offensive line was on par with the 2016 offensive line. Don't you? I mean, Sam Baker still, he was healthy. He was upright. He was playing. They had Justin Blaylock. I say that's a wash between him and Levitri. Maybe you give the edge to Blaylock.
It's not far apart, but
Mack obviously is better, but McClure's no slouch of a veteran. And then right tackle was Clabo still? He was on that 12 team.
That was Clabo.
So Clabo and Schrader are probably a wash. And then the right guard you probably give to Chester over Cons, obviously, but I think you're just more thinking, Dirk Cutter in the back of your head when you're talking about the 2012 offense, as opposed to, I mean, yeah, Michael Turner they overworked him, and that had a lot to do with it. But so I would obviously rather have Devontae in that role, but I don't know.
No, I see why you say it. I'm just thinking like Clabo and McClure kind of washed at that point. Like they had dropped off pretty far in 2012. Like that wasn't sort of like offensive line wise. Like I would certainly, if you wanted to take the 2010 line over the 2016 line, I wouldn't argue.
Now we're just moshing all sorts of factors.
Yeah, so like it's like if you could take certain units. Like I don't know. I feel like that 2016 offense was just so cohesive, working together. I just feel like
it absolutely was.
The 2012 is just kind of like three really good players in Matt Ryan, and that's about it, And it was just those four guys just really sort of carrying the rest of the group. So, like I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I just feel like I don't know if Kyle Shanahan's going to get that much more out of that other unit that he get out of the 2016 unit. But I guess to answer the question, I mean, like, yeah, the 85 Bears is a little bit before my time. Like, I didn't really start watching football till the 90s. So, maybe if you want to go, I don't know, some great defense in the 90s, I can't even think of one. The 92 Cowboys or something, I don't know, or 95 Cowboys when Dion was there, that might be worthy of comparison. But from what I know, like pretty much any defense before like 2005, I'm gonna give the benefit of the 2016 Falcons offense, just because every defense prior to that was really geared towards stopping the run as opposed to stopping the pass, because it wasn't as much a passing league as it is today. And so, like, you're going to get matchups where you have these 250-pound linebackers trying to cover Tevin Coleman out of the backfield, and Tevin Coleman's just going to roast those guys. So, like, I feel like these different era comparison, this offense versus, isn't really fair, just because it's just not a completely different game, but, like, it's just, in the past you had Jesse Tuggle, which Jesse Tuggle was a great linebacker for his era, but Jesse Tuggle's not playing today, in covering.
So what you're telling me is Ray Lewis wouldn't be a Hall of Fame linebacker if he played today, right? Is that what you're saying?
No, Ray Lewis would be perfectly fine.
All right, well, he was on that team, so you don't think he'd be able to stride for stride with Tevin? Especially, we're talking Ray in his prime, though. We're talking 2000 Ray.
4.36 Tevin Coleman? Come on, man. No.
All right.
Tevin Coleman's probably the fastest guy on the team. He's faster than who?
Yeah, no, there's no arguments there, but
like Ray Lewis is great, but like if he's being forced to cover, like they'd probably put Rod Woodson on Tevin Coleman or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just feels like it's a disadvantage for old teams because they have all these big old.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So I don't know, but like pretty much anybody that has a great pass rush, like probably the 85 Bears, I wouldn't want to face, just because I think they had like 2 or 3 Hall of Famers on the D line. I think so. They would probably wreck. several of our offensive linemen. Okay. Mave2124 asks, do you think the Ryan deal will happen after the birth of his twins in early April or closer to the draft like Trufant's extension last year?
I think definitely before the draft. I think it has to be before the draft because, I'm sure they're probably betting on using some of the savings towards, signing the draft pick. So maybe it doesn't have to be before, but I would say right around, shortly after maybe. Obviously it would be nice if not only is Ryan, enjoying celebrating the birth of his two new children, but also a new contract. That would be cool if they line it up that way. But I don't think it's necessarily going to work like that. But yeah, the talks today at Georgia's Pro Day with Thomas Dimitroff. I mean, that doesn't make me think that they're not making progress or that it's really going to be pushed off, until like the season or anything like that. I think it's definitely going to happen at some point. Before training camp at the very latest starts. So yeah, that would be my take, I guess.
Yeah, no, I always sort of thought the earliest it would happen would be like the week after Easter, like that first week of April, because that was when Trufant signed last year. I think Trufant was like April 9th. And Ryan's deal is much more complicated than Trufant's deal was going to be. And so, like, that to me was like the best case scenario. It was like April 9th, I guess, would be this year. I never really thought that, and sort of what we heard today from Thomas Dimitroff didn't necessarily make me think that, that prediction would be off the mark. But, everybody's just sort of been talking about Ryan getting this extension like it's right around the corner. I don't know. I just never really saw that as a realistic possibility, but I was hopeful, certainly. As far as because I don't know, it could happen sometime in April. The way that people have been talking about it, like it is something that the Falcons are planning to get done before the draft. But it could also happen in May or June. That always seemed to be a lot more realistic to me than the April stuff, but we'll see what happens. All right, last question comes from ATL Sports 404. Fill in the blank. The most improved player on the Falcons in 2018 will be
Duke Riley. I think he's a pretty obvious choice, and I think a lot of people, I don't know why, are writing him off already. Kind of doesn't make much sense. Anytime a rookie gets hurt during the season, that's just it's the worst thing that can happen to you. Because, that first year is all about development and learning and getting those reps. And when you're not there, you're not going to get them. So when you do get on the field, you're not going to look great. And at times, Duke Riley didn't look great. And then, seeing people say, oh, well, that's why the defense started taking off when Duke Riley got off the field. That's a load of baloney. Has nothing to do with it. To me, this defense always seems to take off when guys like Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell start picking up their game, and I think that's the biggest credit to why the defense started playing well. So I think with Duke Riley inserted in the starting lineup now as the will linebacker, because really there's no other choice at this point until they start signing some guys, and I don't think they're going to make linebacker a huge priority besides depth in the draft. I think you're going to see why the Falcons chose Duke Riley. He's always been compared to Deion Jones because of the fact that he was kind of a one-year college player, the same type of player, run and hit type linebacker that Dan Quinn looks for. So I think you're going to see the real Duke Riley in 2018 show his stuff.
Yeah, I think Riley's a obvious choice. It's hard for me to come up with someone better than that. I agree with your point that I think you could certainly say that, yes, Riley's injury led to more defensive success, but I don't think it was addition by subtraction the way that people say it. I think a lot of it is that, once Riley was out, Deion Jones just started playing harder and playing better because he probably knew that he had to pick up more slack. given that, in his performance in those weeks prior to Riley getting injured was not particularly good. And I'm sure Jeff Ulbrich probably told him as much in the film room. So I think it's more of a coincidence than necessarily a causation. But if I had to go with somebody else, I'm gonna go with let's go with Marvin Hall. I think Marvin Hall has gotten a bad rap. I think this often happens with Falcons players, particularly when you have a mess up against the Saints. People tend to be like, "Oh, you're the worst football player alive." It happened to James Stone a couple of years ago with that bad snap, overshadowing otherwise what had been like 7 good corners of center play, where he was actually better than Mike Person on the field. But you never heard that from me. Team James Stone for life. Now with the Oakland Raiders. But Marvin Hall, he had that the butt pick. Obviously, not a great look for him. But I think that has overshadowed what was up until then a pretty solid first year in Atlanta. Obviously he wasn't necessarily maximized offensively, but that is something that you could literally say about every player on the Falcons offense. So I don't feel like, singling him out for that is somehow, a crime against humanity. But he showed a lot of speed. I think he showed a lot of potential in the preseason. The fact that when Julio Jones and Taylor Gabriel were both out injured, it was Marvin Hall that was getting the start at their that X wide receiver position, I think said a lot about him and where the coaching staff thought his development was. I think as the season wore on, we saw him get on the field and be a stronger part of the equation. He was a pretty good gunner on special teams, and that was one of the reasons what Matt said earlier, where it's a little puzzling why the Falcons decided not to put him back out there towards the end of the season after C.J. Goodwin got cut. But I think a lot of it may have had to do with that butt pick and the Falcons coaching staff having had enough for whatever reason. But I do think he'll come back strong this year and sort of prove people that he's a much better football player than what they probably perceive him to be, because I do think a lot of the things that Taylor Gabriel did last season, not necessarily in 2016, but a lot of the things that Taylor Gabriel did last season, I think Marvin Hall can easily fill those shoes and be a vertical threat with his 4.3 speed. And I think he's a much more polished receiver than I think a lot of people realize, that you just didn't get the opportunity to see him show that polish just because he was only targeted 5 times all year long. And I think too often people sort of focus on, if a guy doesn't get the ball thrown to him, he's not open, which is not really true. But I think Marvin Hall is a guy that could definitely step up. So I'm gonna stand for Marvin Hall, but I think Duke Riley is a pretty good pick.
Yeah, with that butt pick too, I don't even really put so much blame on him for that, just because we saw how crazy that season was to begin with, just with some of the weird stuff that happened with Julio's drop catch wide open in the end zone in Carolina. He also had another one where he ended up in Mohamed Sanu's backside, the final game against Carolina, that nullified a catch. So, if that's the only reason Marvin Hall isn't on the field, I kind of think that's an indictment on the coaching staff. Like you said, he provides a skill set that Taylor Gabriel provided, and he has some nuance to his game that we haven't quite tapped into or seen fully. And then also adding on, how you said, the special teams aspect. So Marvin Hall is definitely someone that I've kind of locked into, at the very least, being the 5th receiver on this depth chart, with the potential to maybe creep up to 4 or potentially 3 at certain instances, depending on the type of looks they want to give, with him being more of an outside guy and Hardy and Sanu mainly being inside guys. So, and then it also boils down to what they do in the draft at the position. But I think that's a good choice. Another one that I kind of surprised you didn't want to take is Austin Hooper. I think Austin Hooper also gets way too much blame on Twitter, and it's just a couple drops. People just want to blame a player for a couple plays, and obviously it's not right. But I think Hooper is going to continue to take that step. And tight end's one of those positions where there's a steep learning curve in the NFL at tight end. So year 3, I think, is definitely the year that we're going to see, Austin Hooper's best and see his true potential shine through.
Yeah, and one last bit about Marvin Hall. That play, the butt pick, he did get open against Marshawn Lattimore, who's, the defensive rookie of the year. So he clearly showed that he can separate from quality corners in the league. It's just got to catch the ball, which, guys drop passes. I'm not sort of saying like dropping passes is nothing, but it's one of those things where it's like, don't judge a guy on one drop pass, And I think with him and Matt Ryan, particularly if they can sort of work together in Florida this year and help get on the same page, I think Marvin Hall and Justin Hardy will have some opportunities to really showcase their skill set this year on offense. And I think Reggie Davis is another guy that could sort of, as far as if you're looking for a guy to fill Taylor Gabriel's role as far as like jet sweeps and screens go, I think Reggie Davis is perfect for that. That's really where he sort of will shine this upcoming season. So I do feel like the Falcons can sort of fill that Taylor Gabriel, that 2017 Taylor Gabriel. Obviously, everybody wants that 2016 Taylor Gabriel, but we'll see what Sark does. But I'm not necessarily overly optimistic that we're going to see 2016 Taylor Gabriel anytime soon. All right, guys. Appreciate Matt joining us. Matt, go ahead and plug where people can find you on Twitter and where they can find you elsewhere online.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Matt Karoly, MattKaroly, and you can catch some of my work at RiseUpReader. I haven't written something in a while, but hopefully when free agency finally dies down, I'll give a piece to wrap up that and kind of to transition and segue into Falcons draft plans. So keep an eye out for that.
All right. Well, we appreciate everybody for tuning in. We will be back next week to potentially recap more Falcons move or maybe start pivoting towards the draft, depending on what happens over the next 6 or 7 days. But until then, if you want to get your questions answered on the show, you can use the hashtag Falcons mailbag. Tweet at myself. I am at FalcFans. You can tweet at Scott at Karasik S. You can also tweet at the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC. Of course, Pro Football Central is the home of the show at PF Central. Check out ProFootballCentral.com for all the links where you can find the show on iTunes and various other podcasting platforms. Be sure to check us out on YouTube at Falcons Central Radio. Search for that, or you can subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page. Also subscribe or give us a like on Falcons Central Radio on Facebook so you can catch the live shows there as well. And again, Matt, appreciate you for filling in for Scott. Just want to let people know that we will have a couple of other guest hosts for Scott in the near future. Don't worry, Scott will be back in April. He's just taking a brief hiatus, and we'll keep these things going. And maybe, Matt, if you're willing to do so, you can fill in a future episode that we can really dial down on this draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I always appreciate you having me on Talking Falcons.
All right. So let Scott know how much you missed him on the show. And, not at the expense of Matt, who did a great job. But, we'll be back next week to talk more Falcons. And until then, guys, you